Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if the Sino-Soviet split had led to a war. At first it seemed that the USSR and the People's Republic of China would become allies on paper, but because Mao and Khrushchev had suddenly different interpretations of communism, things fell quickly apart. Of course, it was not just an ideological problem. China and Russia had in the past many territorial issues, and Russia was seen as the bad guy by China, while Russia and the USSR to a lesser degree wanted to exercise a lot of influence over China. This was something that Mao couldn't really accept, as he wanted a China that was not too dependent on other powers. Mao and Khrushchev met with each other several times, but it was clear that things could not continue in the same way. Another reason was that the USSR was too friendly with India in the eyes of Mao, and Moscow was afraid that Mao was not careful enough with nuclear weapons. The whole thing continued, and Mao considered the USSR as social imperialist, a catchphrase they used from Lenin. It basically means that the USSR was socialist in words, but imperialist in their deeds. The world's perception changed a bit after the Sino-Soviet split, and also probably during the Tito-Stalin split. Communism was not seen as a monolith, but the West saw that the different communist states had their own interpretation of communism or followed their own national agenda to some extent. It also caused shortly a tripolar world according to some people, but at the end Mao chose to accept US approachment, and while both didn't become allies, the world was seen then as bipolar. China was communist, yes, but was not seen as a US enemy. It's true that the Soviets and the Chinese collaborated on several occasions, but in other occasions they had proxy wars against each other, where the Soviets supported Ethiopia and China supported Somalia. And there were even border clashes between the two superpowers. One clash was 8 months long, the so-called Sino-Soviet border conflict. There was an ambush on Zhenbao Island which took the Soviets completely by surprise. But an escalation fortunately never happened. So what if all of that changed? What if the Sino-Soviet split had led to a war? Let's just say that in this timeline the ambush on Zhenbao Island would lead to a war. Most historians nowadays agree that it was an act of aggression from the Chinese side. It would certainly be seen as a risky move, but yes, the Soviets could not allow losing their face one more time. They already lost a lot of credibility in 1962, according to even China and other communist countries. So this time around, the Soviets would mobilize and send reinforcements towards Siberia and Manchuria. Nuclear warfare would not be an option, as it would result in a huge international outcry and even intervention from other countries, such as the US. The escalation would go step by step. First, we could continue seeing ambushes in contested areas around Zhenbao Island, but over the time the situation would be very clear, and in that alternate timeline, foreign policy experts they would speak of the war after some weeks. The Sino-Soviet War. Most of the world would react in shock, but nobody would have the power to intervene. Yes, the US could do something, but the US would, as for now, or in that moment, not comment a lot on the situation. But they would make it very clear that whenever nuclear bombs get dropped, they would do the same. With that in mind, China and the USSR would at times try to broker a peace deal, but due to the huge ego of Mao, this would have been almost impossible. It is true that China had a huge population and they could mobilize a lot of people and throw them on the front lines, but the Chinese would have several issues. First of all, they would not have yet the same level of military technology compared to the Soviet Union. The troops, they wouldn't be that mobile, the troops wouldn't also be that well equipped, and they would basically rely on that strategy only of throwing a huge amount of men in the battlefields. This would give the USSR the advantage. Yes, they would lose ground in the east in the beginning, but once the reinforcements they would kick in and some additional troops, these troops they would then try to rush to central Siberia and Mongolia and then go towards Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia. The advantage for the Soviets would have been that the low population density would mean very little opposition. It is entirely possible that, depending on how the campaign in Turkestan goes, India would be tempted to join the Soviets in order to fix the borders with China. The Chinese would now not just face a two-front war, but also an enemy that could theoretically just throw any amount of soldiers if needed. Moreover, the terrain on the Indian-Chinese border is mountainous, and China would have had problems beating the Indians anyway. With the Soviet Air Force acting as a support, the Indians would be able to make some good gains. Central points in the west of China would be taken without any further complications. The Soviets would probably also install several puppet regimes, and guerrilla war would not have been such a big issue due to the low population and also because these people did not want to be part of a Han Chinese-led country. Tibet would probably have a chance to become non-communist but closely aligned to India. Nepal and Bhutan would probably also get a bit closer to India as compared to OTL. The one big issue the Soviets would have in this war would be invasions that go in territories where the Han Chinese constitute a majority. At a specific point, the Soviets would probably turn the tides in the Eastern Front and control some parts of Manchuria. The problem we are all aware of is that taking over all of China would not be feasible. The Soviets would of course come up with a realistic peace plan and also realistic peace terms, which the Chinese would only accept after a longer period of time, and also especially after having an economic meltdown and probably after a forceful or spontaneous replacement of Mao Zedong. The peace treaty may be brokered by the US to avoid a Soviet superpower, and also to avoid a complete humiliation of China. China would be allowed to keep most of the territories. Inner Mongolia would not suddenly get annexed by Mongolia, but Manchuria could regain its independence, and we would probably also see an independent communist Uyghur state. Tibet too would be free but non-communist. Where does this leave us? The Soviets would probably get a lot of benefits from it, but they would also have lost tons of soldiers and equipments that they can't use anymore to control their puppet states or to send them to Afghanistan. A lot of money would have been pumped into the war and the economy would not be the best, but the Soviets would certainly make the Chinese pay war reparations for it. As a result, the Soviet economy could improve over time. Some productions for the Soviets could be done in China after Mao would not have been in charge. I can't really predict who would have been in charge, and I also don't think that Taiwan would suddenly just reinvade the mainland. This means that the relations between China and the US would be butterflied away, and we would not see Nixon going to China in this timeline. An interesting development would be happening in India. India would now have their own sphere of influence with Tibet, Nepal and Bhutan. Due to the fact that they had won with the Soviets against the Chinese, they would feel emboldened enough to sometimes create conflicts with Pakistan, which they would be able to win more often than not. It's not impossible that India may even try to influence Myanmar or Sri Lanka and even intervene with the military there if there is a need to do it. This would put them sometimes at odds with the US and even the USSR. The West would also change because of the fact that the factories would not all start moving to China but be kept in the West. It's also possible that either a country like Brazil may be discovered for economic purposes, or India may actually get closer to the US and have colder relations with the USSR after neutralizing China and Pakistan as a threat. It is very likely that at some point the Chinese would rebel again, but the Soviets, they would not intervene, nor would they be able to calm down cities of several million people. If something bad would happen, they would just try to defend the factories and equipment they had. But even with such a good ending for the Soviet Union would not just magically solve all the problems that they had, and we could still see a collapse of some sort happening. China in that case would become a mess as well, and probably also see a collapse, and we may get a vacuum in East and Northern Asia for some time, which would only benefit one country, India. The US would not really gain anything from it, but we can be sure that the economic relationship would be very different in this timeline. And that's where we leave it for now.
That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.